properly worded. Do you want to see?
Do you want to sit down?
Are we okay? We have up.
I'm going to do it very quickly. Here we are. By subscription. Yeah. And with that, I think we're ready. There's a thing saying "got it," where it suggests we have to press "got it" on the Zoom. This is being recorded. We have two excellent chairs right here. Happen to be in the front. Some taking the tables and everything. Oh, we did pretty well. Hello, everybody. I'm Nicholas. I will make some very brief remarks. I am the publisher of Europe Review of Architecture. We are actually right now incorporating as a filing our proper paperwork to become a nonprofit. And so we've been having a discussion about like, oh, what is our mission anyway? And one of the things that came up is you have to say like, how do you serve the public? And I think one of the things that we've actually managed to do over the last 3 years is kind of be able to hold topical conversations in an urgent fashion about topics that matter to the public. We just did that with a discussion about how to make 100% affordable 5-World Trade Center. We did that with our issue number 26, which was all about labor after the unionization drive at SHOP. We even did that a lot, I guess, during the pandemic with a whole series of conversations then. So I think that this conversation falls squarely into that tradition, which is why we are so excited to host it tonight. I would just say some quick thanks to Snowhetta for hosting us tonight, for the Graham Foundation, Thomas Pfeiffer and Tom Billy, who are some of our most loyal sponsors, and most of all to our, I think it's now like 652 paid subscribers. Is anybody here a subscriber tonight? We got like 2, 3, 4. Yeah, that's great, fantastic. Yeah, they keep us afloat, and I would highly encourage you to consider joining them. If you do, you can walk away with your very own copy of issue 29, which is back there. Also, I would encourage everyone to take a lot of pizza and wine, which are also back there. Actually, we just had the pizza arrive, which is quite exciting. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to Dan.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Nicholas, and for all that you do, right? I mean, with the Review of Architecture, it's been a great kind of intervention in the discussion. Always great to, always anticipated, right? So happy to see it. Happy to have a chance to sort of engage and play along with this discussion. What we're going to do tonight, just sort of quickly, so I'm Daniel Barber. I'm a historian of architecture and environment, and write a bunch of things and talk about things about having to do with architecture and climate and questions of energy systems and how we do and don't engage with them in the design community. So that's, we'll hear more about that a little bit in a second. But our project today is to talk about the Ipcc report, and we're going to sort of, each of us up here, as I'll quickly introduce the panelists, will be giving a very brief presentation, right? I mean, we're not sort of like the experts reading it and interpreting it for you, but more like the first set of kind of perplexed and befuddled responses of how we all kind of get ourselves through this. And then we'll turn to your, maybe perhaps less perplexed, or I mean, I'll let you decide, but your responses and thoughts. I mean, this is really about staging a conversation, right? So I'm very happy to see you all here. And the only kind of rule of order I would suggest, not quite impose, is that when you enter into the discussion, please just introduce yourself in whatever fashion you see fit, in part because we'll be recording and we want to know who you are, and so that we can see what you said. And in theory, this will be transcribed and published in one of the issues coming up with the Review of Architecture. So that's our kind of order of business. So a couple of really quick presentations and then opening up to discussion, right?
By the way, someone is in the waiting room.
Oh.
On Zoom. Yes, it's a touch screen.
Is it a touch screen? Ah, nice. Okay. Sweet. technology. Okay, so the subject of our discussion is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? Has just released over the past year what is called AR6, Assessment Report 6, right? The Ipcc is in its 27th year, and they periodically release these reports. I'm sure this is kind of well known to some of you, or maybe you don't care for others, and that's all fine, the details, but I'm not going to go through a lot of them, but just review a few things. So this is the 6th assessment report, right? And that report is indeed an assessment both of the kind of geophysical state of things, right? The first working group 1, is focused on the scientific data, right? And that report came out, I think, in September of last year or so. Working group 1, this is kind of the state of where things are. And we're not going to really talk about that report so much, but the tenor of the report tends to be, last time we thought it was going to be bad, and in fact, it's a lot worse than we even thought it was going to be, and so we don't quite even know how to model these things anymore, right? Or they do, actually, but it's increasingly adjusting the models and expectations as they go. Working group 2 is adaptation. That came out, I think, in January. But what we're really focusing on is working group 3 of the 6th assessment report, right? You can already see these acronyms maybe piling up in your head, which focuses on mitigation, right? How will we collectively as a global society mitigate the most extreme effects of the climate emergency, right? And one of the things that is nice about reading these reports is it's not about managing these issues in the future, right? But there's a nice consensus within the scientific community that's involved in assembling these reports. We're engaging with this right now, right? So it's a question of how does one collectively mitigate these conditions of climate instability so as to lessen the damaging impacts on the social fabric, right? I mean, this is the kind of question of mitigation. To make less severe, right? That's what mitigation tends to do. So we're then focusing in a little further on a specific piece of that mitigation report, both the chapter on buildings, chapter 9, and then also the kind of section on buildings and the technical summary, right? So TS 4.5-E or something like that, right? I'm going to get into that sort of language. And it's in part because, I mean, I think we all, presuming that we're all coming from some form of participating as workers and people in the built environment, in the production of the built environment, we might understand intuitively, right, that buildings have a role to play. The building industry, broadly understood, has a role to play in that mitigation process, right? So which is to say, the way that we live in and construct our building, and again, forgive me for being overly pedantic, right? I mean, this is stuff I'm sure we all know, but just to kind of get these issues on the various tables that we're at. The ways in which we live in buildings, the ways in which we continue to design and impact buildings will have a profound effect on the capacity to mitigate, right, these deleterious effects of the climate emergency. So I'm just going to make a few kind of quick, very broad kind of opening points, and then we'll turn to my dear colleagues here to make their own interventions, and then again we'll open up to discussion. So one of the points I want to draw out of this report is the distinction that's made in the Ipcc language. A lot of it for me is about language and kind of how they're framing this sort of problem and potential mitigation developments. So the first one I'm interested in is this question of efficiency versus sufficiency, right? And it's in part because, and this was one of the things that really struck me in reading it myself, and I know you were all required to read it before you came in, so I'm not going to quote the text, right? But that since circa 1990, when these numbers started to be gathered, I think it was actually 92, right after the Rio Earth Summit, the improvements in efficiency in what we'll call the over-industrialized nations of the global north, right? I mean, I guess it's another thing to keep in mind, which is that the general introduction to the mitigation report, not just the buildings bit, clarifies that the relative to the ongoing production of carbon emissions, right? People that are still polluting is by and large the top 10% of the kind of global income bracket, right? We could probably make some assumptions about the client base for architectural design services tending to operate within that kind of top 10%. Of course, there's plenty of important exceptions, but I think it's an important thing to, I think, keep on the table, right? That we're engaged with that overproductive capacity of carbon emissions. So the point being that improvements in efficiency, largely in the global north, the way the buildings operate, everything that we've thought of as LEED and BREEAM and sustainability, et cetera, those efficiency improvements have been overwhelmed by a expansion of just the spatial capacity of our built environment, right? So all of our buildings work, not all of them, many of our buildings work much more efficiently, right? But they are also much larger, quite simply. And we can think about suburbia, right? In this context, right, over the last 30 odd years, the standard house, of course, has grown dramatically, and in such a way that is kind of compensated for those efficiency interventions, right? So even though we've got all the perfectly tuned glass panels and the solar panels and the thermal mass and the other, induced ventilation and all the other things that might be within the toolkit of the sustainably minded architect, in sum, all of those effects have been overwhelmed by just the more square footage that we all kind of seem to need, right? Or that clients expect or ask for, or right, I mean, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. So we're kind of back at, in a sense, even though we've done such a great job as architects and architectural scientists, we're kind of, still at zero, still at sort of the beginning of this process of really figuring out how to enact substantive change. So against that premise of efficiency, right, what the UN proposes is that we should focus on sufficiency, right? And this is also kind of a reduce, reuse, recycle thing, right? Reduce being one of the, use less plastic rather than recycle the plastic that you have, right? Require less of a building rather than make it do a lot better, right? So less square footage, less heating and cooling, less concrete, less electricity, kind of everything, right? Demand management, right, is the phrase that I really like that they use in this context, which is to say, do more with less. I think that was Bucky Fuller. We could probably work Elisa in there too somehow, but demand management as a kind of strategy that allows us to reduce, not to use energy more efficiently, but just to require less energy. So I'll quote briefly from the report. Sufficiency is about long-term action driven by non-technical solutions which consume less energy in absolute terms, right? So you don't need as much cooling in a sufficiency model, right? You don't have, maybe you also have a more efficient cooling system, but the intervention at stake, the sufficiency intervention that will mitigate the effects of climate change are just about needing less. So they list a number of sufficiency interventions, including bioclimatic design, multifunctionality, shared spaces, circular materials, lifestyle changes, usership rather than ownership of appliances, right to repair, right? I mean, these obviously go far beyond the kind of specific building design project, but nonetheless. So just to give a kind of flavor of that. So that's the first thing, this kind of sufficiency, efficiency distinction to learn from. The other piece is just the kind of continued alarm bell, right? And again, in the general introduction to the mitigation report, that is the kind of executive summary, right? That's reflecting the broader assessment report project. There's a kind of sense of fatigue from the scientific community of like, everything we told you last time is still happening, but worse, right? I mean, they basically say that in so many words. The International Energy Agency, some of you may have seen this, The Guardian's been reporting on this quite actively, has basically suggested, a technocratic agency that kind of manages the global oil regime, petroleum regime, no more fossil fuel energy installations by 2025 initially, right? And then now just, I think, a month ago, another report came out saying, well, actually, that's too late. Like, we basically already stopped. So any fossil fuel, coal-fired electricity generating plants, et cetera, that are currently in the planning stages should be stopped, right? This is the position of the UN, of the International Energy Agency, by 2025, right? So the reason I think that's really important for us is to recognize that, buildings are kind of like little tiny fossil fuel plants, right? Or many of them, and we could debate that and kind of get more nuanced as far as that goes, but it's clearly dependent upon the fossil fuel industry and the kind of flow of certain types of energy materials. So how do we kind of fit ourselves as cultural agents engaging with the built environment relative to this imperative to, in effect, stop any project that will require more fossil fuels, right? I mean, that's the kind of existential aspect of this that I think we have to confront. The UN calls these, the drafters of the Ipcc call such a building a lock-in building, right? So any building you look, I mean, we don't have much of a view here, but you look around Lower Manhattan or wherever you want to look around and see the cranes going up and the steel and concrete and glass skyscrapers that will follow in their wake, and these are lock-in buildings, right? They might be very efficient, again, right, in terms of using that energy very well, but they are locking in more carbon emissions, right, over the duration of their lifespan, which is, as we know, anywhere from kind of 20 to 50 to 80 years, locking in more carbon emissions, locking in more climate disruption. I mean, locking in more death and destruction. We don't need to kind of play around in this context, right? When we look at, when we kind of look at those building sites and then maybe think about, I mean, the one in the news today, right, and it's not a small issue, the ongoing heat wave or sort of heat conditions in the Indian subcontinent, right? We need to be making those connections between the lock-in buildings and the kind of locked-in atmospheric conditions that are literally causing death and pain and violence as we speak, right? So to be really part of this second point is to be really sensitive to this kind of lock-in building. Okay, so the third point, and then I'm pretty much done, is another thing the UN mentions at the end of the technical summary, is that this decade, the one that we're in now, right, 2020 to 2030, is the decade for sort of upskilling or reskilling the building industry, right? And again, this is industry-wide. This is not only focused on architects. So contractors and suppliers and material channel, there's all sorts of things to be kind of taken into this broad umbrella of the building industry. So a reskilling, a decade of reskilling, right? And I think this is something that I'm really curious to hear from all of you about, sort of what those reskillings might be, or what you've kind of tried and worked with, or what you anticipate. Certainly as a pedagogue, as somebody working in an architecture school, right, I sort of take that as a very clear directive, right, a kind of item on the agenda for every faculty meeting. And over the next decade, how shall we reskill, right? So I don't know, and I hope to build into that something of a sense of hope, right? Which is to say not optimism of kind of maybe this will work out, but hope as a sort of project, right? We have to figure out how to get from here to where we want to go. And part of that project is retraining ourselves and our colleagues, right? And even, if I dare say so, seeing architects in particular as sort of cultural agents and in many ways cultural leaders of the built environment industries, of the building industries, encouraging that retraining more broadly. That was kind of hopeful, right? Kind of optimistic. We'll see what we can do. So the last thing I'll say then is just to quote, and I think this was in the kind of blurb at the registration site, to quote Yamina Saheb, a geoscientist, teaches at the University of Lausanne, who was one of the drafters of the mitigation report, of the buildings section of the mitigation report. She was interviewed, this was published in Dezeen, so we know it's relevant to us, right? Interviewed about sort of what was going on with that report, and she said that the building sector has not modernized since World War II, right? And we might have some truck with that, right? I mean, we could maybe nuance that a little more effectively in this room. I focus on the modernizing bit. Other people might think about other things, but nonetheless, right? As she's putting it, the building sector is lagging behind dramatically other sectors, and so this is the kind of money shot here, right? Each gram of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings means a mistake in design, right? So this is the finger pointing that's going on, right? And we need to, I think, attend to this. Architecture and urban planners, as she continues, should really look at this report carefully and rethink the way they work, right? End quote. So that's kind of what we're doing here, looking at it, somewhat carefully, right? Hopefully instigating some more careful readings in the future and trying to start to rethink sort of what we're all going to do to get us collectively through this process. That's my sort of very introductory opening out. I'm gonna turn to my colleagues and we'll also do sort of, I don't know, a bit longer than I was supposed to, but kind of 5 minutes plus presentations, and then again we'll update to the group. So Elisa, Iturbe, please.
Sure. Thank you for that. I think that was a great introduction to bring up some of the topics. But yeah, my name is Iturbe. I'm also a teacher, and so I think that these think that a lot of these issues that you're bringing up, Daniel, are also near and dear to my heart, also as someone who really cares a lot about architectural education. So I think, when I received Daniel's email, the question was, can we look at the Ipcc report and talk about what the impacts are for architecture? And so I immediately thought that maybe I could split this into two questions because, I don't have any answers or proposals, and I don't think that's the point of this conversation. But, as a provocation and as a prompt, because I hope, yes, as Daniel said, that this is a discussion, I thought I might split that into two questions, which is what is the impact for architectural labor and what is the impact for architectural thought, which I think they're obviously related, but have different threads within them. And maybe inversely, the question could also be asked in a different way, which is not just how are architectural labor and architectural thought impacted, but also what might they contribute to this conversation. And so by bringing up architectural thought specifically, I don't mean to necessarily allude to a kind of disciplinary silo that we all find to be problematic, but to recognize that there is a conversation within architecture about space, or a kind of familiarity with spatial thinking, spatial problem solving that we engage in as architects, and that's relevant to the issues of climate change in a way that is not often recognized, but I was really surprised to basically see explicitly called out in the Ipcc report in a way. And I was surprised to see that the report recognizes the importance of urban and spatial form. They use the term spatial form, which I did not expect to read in this report. And so I have a quick quote here that they say, the potential and sequencing of mitigation strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will vary depending on the city's land use, spatial form, development level, and state of urbanization. And it says in the same section that we have to think about co-locating jobs and housing to achieve compact urban form. So really they're bringing up questions of spatial planning, of design, things that have long been in the tradition of architecture and planning, and they're basically saying we have to do this differently, we have to do this better. So my question is, thinking about this as a prompt, what do we have to do as architects to rise to this challenge? And, there is a way of talking about these issues that kind of already exist within status quo development. We might start saying, okay, let's do mixed use development, let's do live work units, let's do mixed use zoning. There are kind of things already in a kind of lexicon of conventional development. But as I was thinking about that, I found there's something still dissatisfying about that, and something about still engaging the typical processes of conventional development that I find so problematic. And as architects, in terms of thinking what we might contribute here, we are not only people that build, we are also people who study the built environment and who understand it in a particular way and see its issues in a particular way. And we also study the history of how the built environment came into being. So as this question is being put together by a global governing body, they're coming at it looking at a certain set of information, but we are also a group of people that kind of explicitly studies this within our own kind of tradition. So not that we have the answers because of that, but maybe because we have the capacity to ask the questions in a particular way. And so I find that pretty interesting. And so I think that we can actually bring more questions to the table, more than what they're asking. And actually not take for granted certain things. So like if the Ipcc report says that we have to bring living and working closer together, I think there's a lot within our own sort of mode of thinking that allows us to ask, why were they separated in the way that they were in the first place, right? And that's a long and heavy legacy of modern planning. Of course, the separation of the four functions of the city is something that, in the way that zoning has kind of played out in the history of planning, in the way that the city has sort of come into being, we take these kinds of separations for granted. And there's a lot of inertia behind that way of making space. And I think it comes not only from perhaps how we tell our own stories about space and city making, but also because there's an entire economy of development that emerged around that way of thinking. So I think it's important to recognize that some of these concepts about space that we take for granted they come from architecture, and they come from architects sitting at a table and asking throughout, especially the early 20th century, how do we spatially reorganize society to suit the needs of an industrial economy, right? That's a big conversation that was happening in the 20th century. And it occupies a large portion of 20th century architectural discourse, and that's a legacy that we continue to build on for many different reasons, in part because of the inertia that came from then actually building in that way. And so like when I hear the term carbon lock-in or like the concept of lock-in, I also think about the kind of perjurance of built form. The fact that once you build something, once you configure space in a particular way, that has an impact on how social life plays out. It has an impact on our ways of life. So to undo that kind of thinking requires, I think, a lot more than just proposing mixed-use zoning wherever we can squeeze it in. It's much more than that, right? It requires actually revising our ideas about space, I think, about the city, about the relationship between things in the city. I think we have to question all the things that we've taken for granted in terms of planning. And so, how do we expand ourselves past those four functions? Like, what other functions do we actually integrate? So it's more than just like, let's bring things closer together. It's like, well, what else needs to happen in the city, right? What else needs to be integrated? What else needs to be brought into relation? And I think it's far more than just proximity of work and dwelling. It's far more than efficiency in transit. It may also be questions about how production is integrated into our spaces of dwelling. It may be questioning the nuclear family itself and our configurations of domestic space. Because every proposal for a domestic configuration is also a proposal for a territorial configuration. Because we have so much become dependent on being consumers, that in the way that even we arrange our domestic spaces, there are so many assumptions about where materials come from, where food comes from. So all of these assumptions are up for question, I think, in this moment. And it requires that we as architects confront our own ways of thinking, and that we ask how we confront our own assumptions that we're making from inside our own processes. And without doing that, I don't think we can step up to the challenge that the Ipcc report is asking us to do. Like, without asking those internal questions, how are we really going to rethink land use in the way that they're asking us to? How are we really going to say, okay, you're right, our spatial form is inadequate, but what's the alternative, right? We have to ask a lot of questions before I think we're ready to even make a proposal that would be suitable to the challenge that we have. And so I think that that's a slightly separate question, although not unrelated, from questions of the profession. But the second point I wanted to talk about is how this affects architectural labor. And I don't think the profession is properly equipped to do what's being asked of us, at least not yet. Hopefully there are changes that we can make. But I think it's in part because we are too beholden to the economy of development. And so you brought up this question of engaging the 10%, and through the work that we do, we engage that kind of overproduction. But from the perspective of architectural workers, I think that is a very charged and problematic question for us. And so in that sense, I think we have to recognize that our very livelihoods are entangled in the fossil economy as much as other energy workers are, as much as coal miners are. Our livelihoods depend on this kind of consumption and extraction in the very same way. So the livelihood of your average architect is compromised, right? We're bound by the obligations to produce economic value in the way that the profession is currently structured. We produce commodified and commodifiable space constantly, right? That's kind of what we're asked to do. And that's predominantly what we make. So I think, in fact, in your typical design job, you don't even have the option to think about the questions that the Ipcc report is asking us to think about. And so, that's something that I'd be really curious to hear what people think about tonight. And in that sense, my question or my prompt for the discussion is really about asking, what are the conditions of both architectural thought and architectural labor that can allow us to address these questions in the first place? So what kind of restructuring do we need to do of our own institutions? And by institutions, I'm referring to firms, schools, our own cultural organizations, research initiatives. What kind of restructuring of those institutions do we have to do to create the conditions in which we can even address these questions in a profound and meaningful way?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Sorry, I also tend to start talking more quietly as I go on, so just tell me if you can't hear me at some point. Elise Hunchuck. I'm not from this geography, so bear with me for a moment. A little bit jet lagged at this point today. I am actually originally from Toronto, so not so far away from Toronto, Canada. But my practice is based in Europe, so between Milan, Berlin, and London, where I teach an architecture studio and a landscape studio until recently. So I feel like I'm sort of straddling multiple worlds here, which seems fitting given our space here at NYRA. And I also wanted to say thank you for the invitation, and also to Nicholas as well for giving me. Because I think this is a very important conversation, and for those of you who will be able to see it, there was also, I feel like it's a continuation of the conversation that Daniel and I were part of yesterday at Columbia. And I was also, when I received this invitation, grappling with what to say, because my training is in landscape architecture, but also in philosophy and geography. So this is how I come to the conversation. And so what am I here to share? And I'm certainly not here to talk to you about more technical aspects of what you do. You know this better than myself. But I'm here to pick up on what you both just said, which is to provoke or to ask a few questions of you all, whoever's watching the Zoom, of myself and of us together. So how we work together, how we live together, how we think together. Because I think, the Ipcc report, for all of its faults and contradictions and complexities and opacities, shall we say, does work to try to establish a common shared language that runs across disciplines, across disciplinary and knowledge-based boundaries, so that earth scientists can communicate with economists, can communicate with architects, for example. And we all know this, but I think it's worth saying it and thinking about explicitly, because it's no small goal. And because it's kind of purposeful or thoughtful transdisciplinarity is something worth seeking and pushing for. Which is to say that I want to, for today, to try and encourage or provoke in this conversation a move away from sort of disciplinary exceptionalism, or in which we say and we act the royally, not saying that you're guilty of this, that as if architect or architecture is uniquely positioned to do a thing, but instead actively think about how our practice, whatever form it might take, is actually complementary to others, how we can support others and ourselves, and in learning and education and practice and in advocacy. So in other words, how can we develop agile but hopeful but honest methods and practices to instill and maintain this change that we're seeking and that we're needing in all of its forms. And so in this, I was thinking of three people that I would like to quote, three people that I wanted to share to keep with us throughout the evening as we talk together. The first is a provocation from Daniel from yesterday, who ended with the words of Lauren Verlant and asked, how do we develop new desires? And he asked this of us, if you've read his text on comfort, but he asked this of architecture and architects. How do we develop new desires if the task of design and of architecture and of all of us now is to resist business as usual, so to resist the present? How do we imagine new futures, in essence? How do we develop a hopeful optimism in our practices, an insistent one? Because hope, as American activist Miriam Kappa, who's also a grassroots organizer, educator who advocates for the abolition of the prison industrial complex, knows and says and maintains that, quote, hope is a discipline. And this is, a quote I came across maybe about a year ago, but it's really stuck with me. And I think it's not unrelated to this idea of hopeful optimism. Because the Ipcc report and all of its authors and its contributors are telling us yet again what needs to be done, as Daniel, so eloquently outlined. They give us measures, they give us the scale and the frequency at which change needs to happen. Now, for example, it's existential, fundamental, foundational. So maybe we can spend part of tonight thinking with the words of another architecture historian, Dubravka Stefilic, who so evocatively tweeted recently, as she often does, a furthering of both Miriam and Lauren's words, where she said that, quote, hope is a discipline and our strength is in our relation. And then I would add to this also in our labor and our practices.
Great. Thanks to both of you. Absolutely fabulous. And thanks for joining us. Do you guys want to clap? And yeah, we really just want to open it out. And certainly, you know, the tables are movable. There's some chairs available. You don't have to stay in the same place, right? Does anybody want to get us started with some thoughts or reflections or anxieties? Please, and please just briefly introduce yourself.
My name is Ipcc. I'm like an architecture starting.
Can you hear her?
Researcher. Hi.
Yeah, I think you might.
Everyone hear me? Sorry, I'm so can I speak a little bit softly. I think someone said something that I didn't hear.
That's better.
That's better. Okay. Hi, my name is Ipcc. I'm also like a researcher and teacher around architecture history theory, but also design, and was part of the conversation yesterday with studying with Elise at Columbia. So one of my major research interests is how to develop how to rethink about this whole architecture approach to climate crisis and environmentalism from a post-humanist perspective. And this is also one of my entry points to engage with the Ipcc report. So as maybe most of you know, like the previous UN reports have been really focusing on climate issues from a very anthropocentric perspective that was focusing on like development and sustainability from a majorly like human perspective. And I see this Ipcc report, the similar things is still resonating. And especially I was focusing on the dichotomy between sufficiency and efficiency that Danny was talking about. For example, the long-term characteristic of sufficiency and the short-term characteristic of sufficiency is focusing on one unified scale of time that is based on a norm of human that in itself entails environmental but also social justice. So I was wondering, how do we as an architecture community go again about that in terms of how to reframe architecture thinking? And to connect to that a little bit is the dichotomy between the non-technical solution and the technical improvement here that I found also troubling. So from a again post-humanist perspective, where we see this trans-species possibility that we are constantly redefining what is human and incorporating like animal studies and cyborg, etc. Can we still make the distinction between, let's say, non-technical solutions or architecture solutions against technical solutions or mechanical solutions? Or this dichotomy is also already passé in a way. So that's one of the things I was thinking about it, reading.
Great. Yeah, I don't know that we're necessarily going to kind of respond to, right? I mean, and for certainly if others have questions or thoughts of respond, I mean, I think this question, both the issue of the issue of the time scale in particular really resonates with me in terms of sort of how we've tended to imagine these, you know, one of the jokes at the Glasgow meeting of the Ipcc was that, you know, everybody making the plans was going to be dead by the time those plans were enacted, right? It was a bunch of 50, 60-year-old individuals, right? And the kind of not necessarily attentive to that time scale in the same way, right? But even to go beyond that, to think about future generations, right? One of the difficulties of the economic models that inform the climate debate are that future people, right, don't get to express their desires in kind of choice economic theory, right? So this is sort of related to that too. What are some other, please, somebody else jump in. Yeah.
Also,
can you introduce yourself? Sorry.
Oh, Emily. I'm actually a Columbia as well.
I thought a lot about the nuclear family that Elisa brought up and how we have to challenge that, and how a lot of times in preservation, which is my own field, preserving these older models and like how that rubs up against contemporary theory and practice. But I thought, I don't know, I wanted to know or hear more about what people had to think about that quote, how do we create new desires? Like how can we create a new desire that's beyond that pinnacle of the single family home? Because I think in practice, or that's where we're paid to be designing and delivering and preserving perhaps, but how can we overcome that market barrier? As something that's
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Because I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm really glad that you brought up that quote about how do you construct desire, or how do you change desire? Because when you look at it only from the perspective of the profession, it's so easy to think of architecture as only reifying the status quo, because you depend on the structures of employment, the client, et cetera. And how much can you convince the client to not do a luxury condo? Depends. It depends on a lot of factors. Most likely you'll be ineffective. But at the same time, like, there is in the tradition of architecture, like, the work of proposing different ways of life. Like, it is part of the architectural tradition, and we only have to look at the single family home to see how effectively architecture can construct desire. So like, what if we just designed something differently? Now, of course, can you get it built and can you get paid to do it? Totally different questions in a way. But I think at this point, we have to move outside of the constraints of the profession for a second to be able to do the work of reinventing, because we're not going to find it in the structure of the profession. I mean, we have to, of course, restructure the profession. We have to overhaul the economy of the building sector. I think we have to ask politicians for a just transition for our sector. And that's an ask that we can make as constituents, as a lot of this legislation is written. But I think that there's also this other side, which is about how architecture does actually make proposals for ways of life, and we do that whether we think about it or not. If you design the luxury condo, you still have proposed a spatial structure for a particular way of life. And so I think we just need to become more and more conscious about that. And in my own research, I guess I didn't introduce myself, by the way. So in my own research, I study a lot of the relationship between our dominant energy paradigm and its spatial expressions. And so I guest edited an issue of Blog a couple years ago that Daniel contributed to, which is how we know each other. But in any case, in a lot of that research where I've been trying to look at that reciprocity between energy and form, I've turned to a lot of seminal texts from the 20th century, and some of the work that I find really interesting are the Soviet proposals for the city and for housing, because very clearly they write, and I'm not exaggerating this at all, they will say explicitly, we need to reinvent a new society, we need to reorganize our social order, and so we need architecture to be different. We need the architecture that will enable that change. And I find that super interesting. And of course, in their case, they were fighting to overturn an agrarian world order to bring in an industrial one. So from my perspective, it's not different in terms of proposing, ultimately an architecture for carbon modernity. But there's something really interesting to me in that, right? In this kind of recognition that in order to make the kinds of changes that we're talking about, architecture has to participate in that. And so I think that's both a question of the specificity of what architects can bring to the table and a question of how do we complement and how do we add these things, right? So I think there's kind of a conversation that comes from like the ways that we think about space, and then there's this new conversation that needs to happen given the context that we're in, which is how do we then connect that kind of thinking to the issues at hand.
I should add to that, because I think maybe there's another formulation of that quote, which is how do we acknowledge and make space for existing desires, because we're not in this particular case, and so there is precedent for that, and so and there's a lot of precedent for that, right? How to make space for alternate ways of living. in the past. And so perhaps, there's this trajectory to think through as well. And I realize it's also, okay, we're copying coding, we're sort of playing with language, but I think that's not unimportant. I think that's actually quite foundational to how we frame these conversations, not only amongst ourselves, but like far more importantly, outside of the discipline, precisely with people who are already living these desires and living these realities and have, for example, made space work for them in some other way, right? That's perhaps not particularly acknowledged or recognized by architecture as such or developers, but it exists. So, how do we make space for that?
Very cultivated.
Yeah, or how do we just center other things that already are?
Great. Your hand has been up.
Yeah, my name is Patrick. I thought it was notable when you were summarizing some of the points in the Ipcc report that it seemed like it fell into two scales of action, which was the personal, like use less, maybe change your desires, and then the macro scale of here's this technocratic encounters that we should just listen to. And it skipped over this scale of politics, I would say. Neither of those are political spaces, I think, the personal and the like technocratic expert. So what is IPC's political solution or proposal for like local building codes and things that we could actually influence as the experts, working in our communities?
No, it's funny because I thought you were going to say it skipped over the scale of the building.
Well,
Right,
I would
which is
say,
also
which is also a political scale.
Exactly.
because-
No, I think that's an interesting sort of connection to draw out. I don't necessarily have answers, but I think it is interesting to recognize. I mean, as we track the reports, they claim apolitical. This is just science, right? Just the sort of claim, but they're sort of increasingly agitated in the language and the kind of urgency at the same time, right? So I don't know. I'm taking your question as a kind of instigation of sort of how does this become an opening to a different kind of or a certain focus in a sort of set of politics and sort of policy initiatives. But I think also a really crucial aspect, which it might be part of this kind of reskilling potentially, which is what is the role of the design professions in policymaking, right? And my dear friend Billy Fleming has been sort of tooting this horn relative to landscape architecture for the past couple of years, in institutional environments. I mean, at the ASLA, right? Similar, we can find histories, we can look at similar questions of sort of how and when architects have been involved, but I think that's, also coming back to, I think, some of the discussions we've been having, like rethinking what the social value of what we do is and how we can contribute to this problem, which will be design and will be, cultivating desires and kind of effective space and many different things, but might also be policy, boards of policy analysis and advisement to the recent election in Australia, and some of you may have paid attention to, that is being referred to as the climate election, right? I mean, desperately needed in Australia, which is still very much a coal economy. There's 2 architects in the legislature, right? So, I mean, this is, so again, that's kind of everything and nothing for us in a way. It's not that much, but, it's to say it's people who identify themselves as having something to contribute to this discussion at the kind of policy scale. It's an interesting reskilling, right? Not that that's the only form of politics at all, right? But I mean, this is one. What else? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Matthew. Thank you all for your conversations. As I was listening to you guys, I was thinking of a lecture that I heard previously a month ago from an architect, an landscape architect named Bill Reed. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with his work. He's very new to me. So actually, if you don't mind, I was kind of just like looking at my notes as I was from that lecture, and I'm just going to read a few things because I think they're kind of topical for this conversation. But his whole premise is like, how can we have a holistic view on sustainability and not compartmentalize our ideas? So he says that humans are part of nature. We have a right to be here, but not as we currently are. Says that we're killing the earth through our architectural systems and through our building systems. We also need to heal them through those means. It talks about like earth as an organism, and that again, the holistic approach, not a compartmentalized approach. people who used to live here before us, the Indians, the ancients, they used to see relationships with the landscape. They used to be able to predict and make changes when need be. So just this kind of like high level thoughts on like how can we get back to that type of thinking? How can we as a society and an architectural group like start thinking again holistically and start thinking about like relationships and what projects like we have a project site, but it connects way beyond the project boundaries. We have to really start thinking about how a simple project next door can connect to the city, but also to connect the global network that way. So it's kind of like thinking about those ideas, and I don't have the answer to that, but like how can we as people become more holistic?
Right. When I get also seemingly on a timescale, this would be suppressed.
Right.
And then I want to stop.
But I also want to ask, if anyone in the audience wants to respond.
Yeah, no, indeed.
I don't think we do have the answers. We have opinions and ideas, but.
I have an opinion about it. I just really hate how those propagandas about like killing the earth, protecting the earth, healing the earth, because it's so condescending from a human over nature perspective. Like the earth doesn't need us to survive or whatever. It's just part of the whole narrative that I was pointing to about the anthropocentrism that I just really hate, but I just want to point that out. And I feel the heroic sentiment is also especially resonated in the architecture heroicism.
Yeah, I have a question that diverges a little bit. But, I'm Guillermo. I'm a PhD candidate in History and Theory of Architecture at Princeton University. And I have a question, or more a couple of thoughts. I'm going to use the efficiency and sufficiency terms to maybe guide them, because I'm going to refer a little bit to the systemic way to understand these things that Elisa was pointing to. It seems to me that while efficiency has scored very well by development and capital expansion, let's call it, and turn into a commodity, sufficiency might be a more difficult challenge. Because it seems like a conundrum that I don't know how. So one question would be: is that points to a structural change in how we understand space with linked to economy and to growth and to development. So yeah, I guess my thought is like, can sufficiency really happen without structural change, just without thinking that like something beyond the spatial reconfiguration needs to happen, and pointing directly to economy and capital, I guess. And yeah, another way also to think about it that caught my attention is like what Elisa split between architectural thought and labor. And I was thinking maybe, one of the ways to approach it is thinking architectural thought as labor, which might be also what you were pointed out, but in a way that because it's not a commodity, it's not labor, or there have been previous tries to do that, but I guess if that could be a fairest, way to put it.
Yeah, please go ahead.
These are great comments, and I think the first I just want to respond to, is there something beyond spatial configuration? Just to clarify, at least some of the ways that I've been thinking about this and speaking about it tonight, because I think it's easy to say, okay, if we're only thinking about spatial configuration, then we're only thinking about form, and then we're kind of excluding all these other questions of economy, right? But I think there's a way in which we might actually recognize the way that architecture gives form to these economies. And in my mind, that was what the modern project was, right? The modern project was to say, okay, industrial society is sort of burgeoning and it's creating a chaotic mess. What we need to do is to give it form. And in so doing, we architects or planners and everyone sort of lent it the efficiency that it needed to kind of cement its processes, right? So I think it's not, to me, about then taking those spatial configurations and saying, let's move them around again as though a chessboard. And in many ways, that's why, to me, the way it gets described in the report is like, let's just put things close together, is not enough. I think it's more about asking, how can we, as architects, actually help to make room for these alternative modes of life, which currently are suppressed by the very spatial configurations of them, right? So I think it's less about saying, okay, like through some sort of formal invention of mine, I'm going to somehow solve things, but rather to say that the work of designing and the work of making space is also the work of giving form to very specific ideas about politics, economy, how wealth is produced, how subsistence happens, how livelihood is achieved. And I don't feel like I can live my life in the way that I want, given the kind of spatial structures that we exist within, right? We have very little sovereignty over our food, over our energy. But so what does it take then to make that? Of course, it's not, you're not going to solve it with a single building, but there's a way in which I think architecture can lend itself to solving the problem of opening up space for different relationships to emerge. And that, to me, is where the work of architecture participates through form in these transitions. And I also don't think that there'll be some kind of like totalizing top-down, like we'll propose a new spatial system and a new socioeconomic system, and they will yeah, exactly. Here you go. Like, yeah, exactly. Here's the new building typology that will solve everything. Of course not, no, but I think if anything, it's about asking, okay, here's a community. We know that they are a low-income community, but we also know that due to everything that's happening, we want to help them in this case. If, let's say, I'm imagining a fictional scenario where an architect is engaged with a community, where they want to reduce their dependence on global supply chains. What does that mean, right? That means that whatever it is that is currently bought at Walmart, at Target, or whatever, needs to be produced somewhere else. It needs to, so I think that there are all of these things where then the questions of production have to be reknit into the city in a totally new way. And we have to imagine, as we did in COVID, like when supply chains suddenly stopped, we saw a spatial contraction. And I thought that was really interesting, actually. And you saw that what we do right now is we pump energy into the system to hold everything really far apart. And as soon as that energy is taken away, things kind of contract. So there already was a sort of spatial configuration that happened in that moment when that energy source suddenly collapsed and the supply chains collapsed momentarily. So I think to me, like rearranging things in space is not a passive or apolitical or something outside of politics. It's actually, or we might not be cognizant of it, and it seems apolitical, let's say, but like every proposal for a spatial configuration is always political. It always creates hierarchies. It always has certain affordances, right? It allows access to some things and it disallows access to others. So it's always about power, kind of, no matter what. So maybe that's one thought just in terms of your question of like, is there something beyond spatial configuration? Of course, right? But spatial configuration in my mind is like knit into all of those things. And then your point also about architectural thought as labor, I think that's a great way to basically put it. And in many ways, when I actually first wrote out my notes, I had it as the discipline versus the profession instead of thought versus labor. But I thought that was a little bit too limiting, actually, in many ways, because I do think they are more knit together. And I think, as an educator, we're often talking about like, okay, how do we prepare students for the profession? How do we prepare them? And there's always this question of like, is what we're teaching students enough for them to be kind of ready for the profession? And I just find myself continuously asking myself in the inverse, like, I feel like we're preparing architects in school to ask all these questions that they can't take on in the profession. So how do we actually reshape the profession so that the questions that we're asking in this work of architectural thought, and which is labor, of course, but then where can that labor then be executed, or like where can it be brought to bear on the actual built environment? And that to me is the richness of saying, what is architectural thought as labor? Because then we're asking, where can architectural thought like play out in the material world, which I think the options for that are currently very limited.
Okay.
Sure.
So do you do we need to focus on changing that political paradigm that architecture gives form to from within architecture, or from outside on and affecting architecture from the outside?
I mean, I don't think architecture is currently engaged in making those kinds of proposals, but I think there are a lot of other proposals right now around things like degrowth, or like there are already like other movements around alternative ways of life that we might start to ask ourselves, how can we make space for those things? So I think in many ways if there is an inside and outside, I feel like there are certainly movements that are already there and ideas that are already there about how to live. And I think for me, the job is more about recognizing all the ways in which we configure space, limiting those possibilities of alternative ways of life, and then asking how we might open them. But I would not necessarily claim that architecture will kind of author modes of life as much as we have to recognize that architecture imposes modes of life always, no matter the form it takes. So then our responsibility is to say, okay, well, where do we align ourselves or misalign ourselves and our work with all of these things that are happening? So I wouldn't propose that architecture can really, that becomes a moment where architecture really is just imposing and like, that was the modernist project in many ways. I'm gonna put the workers here, I'm gonna put the offices here, and now everyone lives like this, right? So I don't think that really, although of course those economic ideas didn't come necessarily from within architecture, so I think it's muddy.
I keep thinking about, as we're talking, an insight that came up, I think, in the discussion a second ago. You know, the suburbs was produced, right? I mean, as a historian, right, this is like, okay, I'm thinking about how did that happen, right? And I'm thinking about all of these sort of mostly corporate-driven experimental houses, you know, plywood houses, American Standard houses, and there's a whole kind of realm of them in the 30s and 40s that were kind of seeing the suburbs as an experimental place, right? I mean, you know, towards what we would maybe call a conservative end, in the sense of, you know, reproducing a family structure that we're all sort of, you know, somewhere, not all, but in many ways, many of us are, you know, stuck with sort of generationally, right, in various contexts. But to say that these were experiments, right, and maybe, you know, so these are kind of, there's room that those experiments then sort of became infrastructuralized, right, and sort of became this kind of, you know, territorial form of expansion that we still are struggling with, right? But it's to suggest, as you're putting on the table, that, you know, those experiments can go other directions, other experiments are possible. And, you know, trying to think sort of almost practically, maybe about sort of how do we start to think about some of these, say, sufficiency interventions, right? Like, is there a space for institutionally supported experimentation, right, that would kind of open up some of these ideas and help them begin currency in the field, et cetera. Yeah, please.
I had a point of.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm also a PhD student in architectural history at Princeton, though not in the architecture school, but the art history department.
What's your name?
Lewis. Yeah, I had a question or comment that was related to cameras and this distinction again between efficiency and sufficiency and potential reasons for the sort of dominance of the efficiency paradigm and its appeals, not only sort of malevolent, but its genuine appeals to architects. And just in the context of the fact that we live at a time, while I think maybe everyone in this room might perhaps agree, maybe I would too, that the climate crisis is the, you know, the most pressing, the most dangerous crisis. We live in a time of multiple crises that overlap and aren't necessarily one and the same. They don't all necessarily require the same kinds of interventions. They're difficult to even think about at the same time, and sometimes they at least can feel like they're at cross purposes. So just for instance, in the narrow American context, we live at a time where there's climate crisis and a desperate housing crisis. And, you know, one of the appeals, I think, of an efficiency paradigm is it's one that kind of invites architects to build differently, but it's one that, like, has you saying yes to projects and to doing more. It's a way of continuing to expand, to develop, and to do it more. It lets you do that. Whereas at least one way of thinking, I mean, a sufficiency program can sound more like saying that, you know, building less, saying no to certain things, even having that be kind of the main priority if it's a kind of a degrowth paradigm. And so I only said the housing crisis is just as an example that seems a little clear to me, but the broader question is, are these real conflicts, or is that is that kind of an artifact? Are there real genuine trade-offs here? We can, if we're doing one thing where it maybe means that we're not addressing another thing, and that might be a hard choice we have to make, or is that is this a false distinction? Is that never the case? There's always a way that we can both urgently be addressing the desperate housing crisis and an urgent climate crisis, or do architects how do you sort out priorities and I'm asking as a non-architect here, how do you think about that, given the fact that it's hard to think about anything other than the day-to-day demands of the job anyway? So how do you balance the priorities of genuinely concerning issues?
And if one can do those things at the same time, what is the context, cultural, institutional, urban, et cetera, that might support that? I want to let others respond or to that question or ask that question. I think one thing we're learning is that historians are trained to speak well, right? And so we're hearing from a lot of historians and PhD candidates that maybe we need to reskill architects to speak your minds, right? Not to be facetious, of course. I do want to hear from designers or sort of people, kind of, let's say in the trenches with the struggle. How do you feel? Like, can you do anything? Or are there things that we're not talking about yet?
The prior comment.
Sorry, but could you introduce
my name
yourself?
is Dan. I'm a NYRA contributor and writer. I'm currently working on a project about how General Motors kind of gutted the US of its public transit infrastructure and is responsible for a lot of gas pollution. But the previous comment was just brought to my mind. I'm doing a lot of work about reconstruction in Ukraine following recent events. And I heard recently that there's going to be protocols issued. So in light of all of the destruction that's happened, there's going to be a demand that it was issued by, I think, Paris. There was an institution in Paris that said that all reconstruction has to be net zero or something, and then a lot of Ukrainian architects said that's a fantastic thing to aspire to, but we need to build housing immediately. And so when you were kind of speaking to how do you balance and hold those two things at once, like pacifying the housing crisis may in some cases be in conflict with meeting these goals. So I just wanted to contribute a good example that I thought was relevant.
Well, and again, what is the support mechanism that would help to facilitate that urgent rebuilding, also being attentive to climate systems?
Yeah, and to your point, the reason that I think it came to mind is that I don't think that there is an institution that can balance both of those things, because one group is saying we need to build net zero, and then there are others that say, well, we need housing immediately.
Well, and there's others that are saying this is an economic opportunity for the design professions, and let's get in there and disaster capitalize the place.
Right, and so where is the body that is able to manage all of these things?
What makes me think, I think it's Naomi Klein that often quotes, I'm quoting someone who's quoting someone, but Naomi Klein brings up Milton Friedman's, it's Milton Friedman who says that when there's a crisis, you work with the ideas that are lying around. And to me, this is like one of those moments where, and going back to the dichotomy between like sufficiency and efficiency, or like rather the way you pose it is like, can you do housing and climate together? And I think it depends on which ideas we have lying around. Like the only reason why it's a problem to build housing quickly is because right now we don't have any good ideas for how to do it differently. That's why it's a problem. And I mean, of course, there are material flows, et cetera, so I'm kind of oversimplifying it. But I do think that there's something so strong about the status quo, like its inertia is so heavy that building quickly brings up all of those problems. But also because I think as, like the work of architectural thought and imagination, like we haven't really been very creative about what the alternatives might be. And yet we're constantly going to be facing these issues. And so, it's not just the war in Ukraine, but we're going to be having climate migration issues constantly. So what happens when an entire city has to be resettled because it's underwater or a massive fire event or any number of things that might happen. We're constantly going to have to be rehousing people, right? So I think going back to Patrick's question of like, do these ideas come from the outside, do they come from the inside? I mean, I think there are of course certain things that we have to always be relating to the outside world. I don't really think we can have an idea of a disciplinary silo because everything we do engages the outside world. So recognizing that is very important. But so then I think part of the question is, if there is this demand for reconstruction that's happening constantly, and we know that we have to live differently, there are ways in which architects, I think, can start to propose things, right, in that context. And so that's working with housing and climate together at the same time, because ways of life have to change, and because these places will have to be planned. And so we're going to have cities that are shrinking, and we're going to have cities that are growing. And as long as we don't propose something different from the alternative, or from the status quo, we will default to it. And so that's where I think there really is a demand for architectural labor to engage the work of proposing things and making these experiments. And so I think we have to do much more than trying to make the existing built environment more efficient. Far more than that, because we will just keep defaulting to the status quo in all of these emergencies, which we will only have more of.
Which is both exciting and intimidating. I think that's my response. We have time for a few more thoughts or questions or interventions. Experiences, frustrations, ideas, speculations.
My name is Bashar. I'm a recent Columbia MR grad. I wanted to go back to the idea about whether to build net zero or build quickly. And I just wanted to give out the example of Beirut, Lebanon, which is facing a huge energy crisis just because of fossil fuels are not being imported and there's a lot of blockades and so on, which led to sort of decentralization, and a lot of people who were just cut off the energy grid decided to put solar panels on top of the roof, and they coordinated with the people who live in the same building. And I just wanted to share this opportunity as that they might not always be conflicting. And oftentimes in our current time, not always obviously, but in some cases, the sustainable or like more efficient route coincides more immediately.
Also, the term efficiency, it's always relative, and I don't think we always realize that. It's like you are making something more efficient. It's not like something that exists in the vacuum. So like in some ways, producing things on the other side of the world is extremely inefficient. But we set up a system that kind of allows it to be efficient, but that's relative. And so, I think that's something that we kind of pretend like that's an absolute, but it's really not.
I think it's also interesting to think about, I sort of made a similar reference relative to the heat wave, right, which is now a 3-month-long heat wave, like it's quite a wave, right, and which is to say how, and you were saying, framing it as a kind of fuel crisis or kind of, experience of lack of access, and there's very specific reasons as to why that's going on, but to reckon, I think part of what we're trying to recognize more broadly as a global culture, and certainly very specifically as a building culture, is the sort of status quo, like however much we might want to hold on to it, right, relative to these various questions and how they're coming up, is no longer, right? I mean, it's this kind of state of flux, and insofar as we, in Lower Manhattan can kind of rely on electricity and kind of these consistent things, I mean, that's at the cost of others, right? I mean, this is not a given, right? This is a huge project that involves, endless economic inequities and geopolitical sort of confrontations, right? So recognizing that maintaining the status quo is in itself a massive political and economic and energetic project, right? And we're seeing these kind of other, situations that are often seen as crisis, wave doesn't necessarily sound bad, but some intervention, some like kind of episode, right? And I think beginning to recognize again collectively that we're now just kind of stringing the episodes together, right, to kind of form our coherent reality rather than some sense of a persistent, consistent future, right, or present for that matter. I mean, William Gibson, I think he is also quoting someone else, but he never says who. But the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed, right? And this was like in the 90s, he was talking about like cell phones and not kind of on 3-month heat waves, right? But the kind of conditions nonetheless apply. What else? We got one more thought on the table here. Please, yeah.
Hi, my name is Bhavani. I'm a senior research science student at Pratt. My idea about like what you were said and what we've been sharing so far, I was just thinking about building net zero or addressing the housing crisis, but I was also thinking about like readaptation. And there are so many structures already, especially in New York City. For example, we're thinking about like decommissioning prisons, we're thinking about decommissioning pico plants. And all of these structures already exist. And just thinking about like readapting, I think that could also be like part of spatial reconfiguration, also be a part of like sufficiency, where we're saying that these things already exist, and the idea of building is I mean, it gives hope and it's optimistic to think that we can build more efficiently, but thinking about like what's existing already and thinking about how to reuse it in different ways. I think COVID has brought that forward, that pandemic has put it in a very morbid way that we don't need certain things as of now. So what about like thinking about things that we don't need anymore and how to use them in different ways to address other crises?
Please, yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I think it also goes on to what we were saying earlier, which is that you turn to what's lying around either in terms of like already existing ideas or materially speaking, right? And you're right, we did see that in COVID a lot, and we do see that in other situations, in Ukraine also, where you are in a circumstance where you use what is at hand, and perhaps it's time to also think stop thinking or to start thinking about things in those terms. What's at hand, in terms of our ideas, but especially materially, and that is also where designers can come in terms of, again, not maybe making space for it, just insisting. I mean, there is also room for that. We do sometimes have that luxury. And also, and I say we as designers, researchers, and for myself, editor, creator, whatever, but like, many hats. But, in all of those hats, with all of those hats, there is some agency that exists. It's, trying to use the tools that we learned that we're, all like constantly, we talk about reskilling, but we already have a lot of skills at hand again. And so, how do you deploy them in the service of what you might think is best? How do you use it, as a form of persuasion? Maybe it won't work, fine, but it's worth, it's always worth trying, to put it very simply, yeah. And I think that can't be understated or overstated, pardon me, the potential of just proposing and just thinking otherwise and suggesting.
And it's interesting again to think of how we see that, right? I mean, I was sort of suffering through the Calatrava, there's a name for it. Oculus, yes, sorry. And was like, how did somebody convince somebody to do this, right? And I can't imagine that conversation personally, right? And who would have listened? But yeah, I mean, persuasion was very, and it might not have been the architect in that. I think it could very well have been a sort of developer city discussion as much as a kind of design discussion or both. I was also just going to say that as a teacher, I was really kind of inspired or felt kind of buttressed when Lakaton and Gasol won the Pritzker Prize, right? Of kind of being able to say, yes, reuse is viable and a kind of career aspiration that one can, kind of aspire to. But so then in that context, right, this is another one of my favorite quotes, I think we're kind of closing up, right? So I'll end with another quote from the Ipcc, quite appropriately. But and I say this with some delicacy, but also relative maybe to this question of confrontation, right? So So here's one of the issues, right, at the global level. Some of this is repetition. This is number 3. Population growth was the first one, and then I already talked about the increasing floor area per capita thing. So number 3 is the inefficiency of newly constructed buildings, especially in developing countries, right? So this kind of notion of technical assistance sharing the knowledge more broadly around the globe, but then this is the kicker. And the low renovation rates and low ambition level in developed countries when existing buildings are renovated, right? Which, I just kind of imagine, I sort of take that personally as part of the field, right? Like our ambition level is like, okay, we're gonna change the carpets and paint the walls, right? We're not gonna, really take this on and kind of reimagine how this existing building that's being renovated can really kind of operate differently, kind of help to, in the way that we're talking, kind of become an experiment, kind of help to kind of offer other models, kind of be different set of tools, et cetera, et cetera. So that question of ambition rate, which I don't want to put on anybody individually by any stretch, but want to suggest that part of our collective project, right, is to raise the bar relative to the ambition level, sorry, I was like, rate can't be right. Relative to the ambition level of the profession, right, not to mention the schools and other aspects of the discipline as we confront these issues for the rest of our lives, right, just going forward. So I want to really thank you all for coming and value, it's really, I'm quite honored to have been, able to talk to you about these issues, and I know all of our time is valuable, and I hope it was valuable for you. Certainly this discussion is ongoing in many different contexts, in many different venues, in NYRA, in other ways, and I'll speak for all of us that we may be available for further questions through email, or certainly this is always a chance to start or continue a discussion rather than end one. So please keep it going, keep it coming, and keep on it. I'm really pleased that there's a group of people that are like, yes, we have to go figure this out on a Thursday night, right? We got somewhere, and we'll just keep going. But I think it gives me hope, frankly.
I have one question before you guys and how to wrap up. Elisa, you had said people on the ground, where you need to look to people on the ground and solutions on the ground. I don't know, there's a lot of, this was a little bit dire overall, I'd say, prognosis. Is there somebody on the ground who gives you hope? Right? Like, a solution that's in action right now that's like, yes, this is something that could be embraced further.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah. All three of you actually, but prompted by Elisa's comment.
Well, the answer that I would give is not necessarily a hopeful one, because in many ways, my opinion is that sometimes we spend too much time looking for hope and not enough time thinking through the problem, at least in climate discourse. And it's a question that I feel like has been especially in the American environmental context, always thrown into any discussion about climate. And my worry about it is that it's almost as though if we don't think we can be effective, why do it? And I find that to be very problematic. And I work on this in all my waking hours, not because I think I will succeed, but because I don't feel like I have another choice. So for me, hope is the wrong frame. So I don't know if I'm the person to answer your question. But I also don't think that is to be nihilistic. It's the opposite. I just think it's the wrong framework. What drives me is not hopefulness, but what drives me is really the tragedy of it, and that it seems to me like such a dark moment in the history of the planet. And so I just don't really see any other option for being able to sleep at night except working on it. So I don't know if that's a good note to end on. Yeah.
Sure, I think this is where maybe we diverge. Maybe it's also a question of just language choice, yeah? I think hope is fundamental, but I don't mean, rainbows and butterflies and let's just plant a bunch of trees. I say that in the context of this, but that's not the answer. But I do believe, and I do believe that quote that I quoted is really fundamental, that hope is a discipline. And it does tie into this feeling of, no, I don't think I'm going to solve, the climate crisis. But as you said also, you can't not try, for myself anyway. You can't not talk about it. And this is where I think the question, and it's also, it is also in some ways, for me, I would say personal, that it's, how do I understand living in the world, or practicing as someone who's been trained as landscape architect in these different ways, how do I practice that with integrity? It's not for myself and my own betterment or my own gain, so to speak, but it is that I see it as a collective effort. And right now, for a whole host of reasons, that effort happens to be in response to things like climate crisis, other questions that might arise, in the interim, but that's what that discipline and that insistence is aimed at. And so, some people talk about radical hope. I'm not sure if that's my particular coming to me, but I think, hope is a discipline and our strength is in our relation, is fundamental right now, and that could change. But I think that's for me a way to kind of get through, and to develop my own framework for collaboration with others, because it is always a collaboration. It just might take different forms.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the word integrity is really important, like how to practice with integrity. And I think ultimately what we're talking about is that like life itself is worth fighting for. And I wouldn't call that hope. I would call that maybe a question of value and recognizing what we value and what we don't value. And knowing what you value, then you take it on and all these things.
I think in terms of what on the ground giving me hope, I think I already said it, it's having all you here in this room, frankly, and I say that very sincerely. Gives me hope to think that people are out there thinking about this and fighting this fight. I think that's what we're on.
Well, thank you. I think, Eric, how fast do we need to get out of here? We have 20 minutes. We have a little more wine and 7 more pizza. We can talk to one another. Or you can hang out with us.
Right, yeah.